Okay, this is the first episode of the Terra Incognita Podcast. Well, it's not really an episode, it's more of an introduction. I'm going to tell you what the podcast will be about, what inspired me to make it, and also why I decided to call it Terra Incognita. So, we'll start with the title. Why did I choose the title Terra Incognita? Well, Terra Incognita is Latin for unknown land. The term was used by cartographers and explorers to describe regions that had not yet been mapped, documented, or explored by Europeans. So, Australia was once a terra incognita. The interior of Africa was once a terra incognita. You get my point. And that's what the podcast is going to be about in a nutshell. It's about the exploration of unknown lands. It's about the people who left behind their homes to explore the new world. I'm going to be looking at how Europeans colonized and conquered much of the globe. The first episode, or series of episodes, I think it'll be about 5 episodes in total, will be about the discovery of Australia. The first episode is already out and can be accessed on both Patreon and YouTube. On YouTube, you'll be able to access a snippet of the episode, and on Patreon, you'll get the full thing. I want to thank everyone who has already subscribed to the Patreon. I want to be able to make more content, but in order to do that, I need to scale back the work that I do. So the money really does help me make more stuff. So very much appreciated if you've already done that. I don't think you'll regret subscribing either. I've got a lot of stuff in the pipeline. I plan to make episodes on the scramble for Africa and the rise and fall of Rhodesia, all things that I find interesting, and I think you will too. But I should say now, the podcast won't just be about the age of exploration. I chose the title Terra Incognita because it has a literal and a figurative meaning. So we've obviously just discussed the literal meaning of the term. Let's discuss the figurative meaning. I think you can use the term Terra Incognita to describe anything that is beyond the bounds or scope of mainstream discussion. The British orator, Jonathan Bowden, uses the term Terra Incognita in this way. So just listen to the clip that I'm about to play you and you'll see what I mean.
So the idea of a sort of Marxian capitalist society or a left capitalist society, which once would have been absurd and is now dismissed as absurd by most progressive thinkers who think they've lost out continuously to what they call the right, because they believe that the capitalist market is conducive to the right and has corralled the society over at the right end of the spectrum. Of course, there's a redoubt, there's a range of opinion that exists beyond the alleged Thatcherite and Reaganite right, which is ne plus ultra, which one can never go near, which is a hidden territory, or a terra incognita, which is an area of terror and psychic blasphemy. But apart from that, they believe that the right has inherited the earth, when in actual fact, much of what this society once stood for has been eradicated to the point of inexistence by the forces that have conquered since 1945 and thereafter.
This snippet is from one of Bowden's less popular lectures, titled Tragedy, Horror, and the Transcendent. This lecture was the direct inspiration for the show title. I've always been attracted to radical and transgressive ideas that are considered blasphemous by most people. And if you're listening to this, I suspect you're also wired this way. Now, it's clear there has been a total inversion of values since the end of World War II. There really has been a cultural revolution. Things that were once considered normal have been pathologized. Things like patriotism, gender norms, these things are all pathological now, at least in the minds of most people. And things that were once considered pathological have been normalized. So there's been a total inversion. And to question this process is to go beyond the confines of acceptable discussion. You can believe in laissez-faire capitalism, you can probably still read Ayn Rand, but you cannot question the fundamental social changes that have occurred since the end of World War II. You cannot question the fundamental cultural changes that have occurred since the end of World War II. The only form of acceptable right-wing dissent is economic. So this show is not just about the exploration of unknown lands, it's also about the exploration of controversial ideas that are beyond the scope of acceptable discussion, which are, in their own way, a sort of terra incognita, an area of terror. Now, some of you might think that these two things are totally unrelated, but I actually think they're very related. I think that some people are inherently drawn towards frontiers. In the current age, there are no more physical frontiers, right? Planet Earth has been almost completely settled and civilized. There's very little left to explore. But the urge to explore remains, and because we can't go out and discover unknown physical space, I think people seek to explore unknown mental space. Now, some people might do this by taking LSD, but I'm going to try and do it by exploring taboo ideas. Now that we've discussed the show title, I want to talk a bit about my motivation for starting the podcast. Why did I choose to make a podcast about the age of exploration? Of all the things that you could talk about, why talk about this? Why center a podcast around this? Well, first and foremost, I don't think you can understand the modern world without first understanding the age of exploration. And quick caveat, when I say the age of exploration, I'm using that term to refer to the age between 1450 and the early 1900s. I don't think it's an academic term, but you get what I mean. So the age of exploration not only led to the most rapid extension of geographical knowledge in the whole of human history, it also led to the most rapid extension of human knowledge. Over the course of roughly 450 years, European explorers visited most of the habitable regions of the globe. They found vast territories formerly unknown to them and mapped, the entire world. The discovery of unknown lands stimulated other discoveries in the realms of science, technology, and the arts. The astronomer was naturally stimulated to further explore the stars. The cartographer was naturally stimulated to improve his maps. The philosopher, upon hearing about foreign lands and foreign customs, foreign ways of doing things, was naturally stimulated to speculate about the nature of man or reevaluate his conception of man. The botanist studied and classified newfound plant species. The zoologist began documenting and researching previously unknown animals. And the anthropologist studied the different customs, languages, and social structures of the peoples they encountered in these unknown lands. Scientific and technological discoveries stimulated geographical exploration, and geographical exploration led to more scientific and technological discoveries. It was a sort of an exponentially self-reinforcing process. So in a very short period of time, you have this absolute explosion in human knowledge. In 450 years, think about how much knowledge expanded in that time. Knowledge not only of the globe, but of the human condition, of science, mathematics, physics. People are discovering new worlds, both physically and mentally. During this time, they're conquering new continents, but they're also discovering new fields of intellectual inquiry. They're discovering the physical laws of the universe, they're reshaping maps, and they're reshaping the boundaries of human understanding and possibility. It's not a coincidence, that the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, which are probably, the two highest peaks of human intellectual accomplishment, alongside ancient Greece, it's not a coincidence that these two periods coincided with territorial expansion. And I think that's always the case. I think that the expansion of human knowledge has almost always coincided with territorial expansion, because life in a state of ascent goes outward and upward, physically, mentally, spiritually. So as Europe's knowledge increased, so too did its territories. And by the early 20th century, almost the entire world was under European control. There were some exceptions. Japan managed to resist European colonialism, though there were some intrusions. China too was largely outside of Europe's control. But Europeans held power almost everywhere else. They held power in Western Europe, Central Europe, and Russia. They held power in both Americas, over all of Africa, Australia, and much of Asia. The planet, water, and land at the start of the 20th century belonged to the West. Individual European nations, such as Great Britain, controlled 25% of the world's total population and land. But But the trend of European expansion that began during the 15th century has not persisted. Since the end of World War II, Western civilization has undergone a rapid and major contraction, and you can confirm this simply by looking at a map. Matter of fact, you can confirm this simply by walking around any major European city. The British people used to control 25% of the world. Now, they're a minority in their own capital. The 2021 census showed that only 36% of London residents identify themselves as white British, and they're projected to become a minority in their own country by 2060. This isn't the opinion of anonymous Twitter users, it's the opinion of serious academic demographers. Among demographers, there is a consensus that even without migration, the white British population will become a minority in the near future. For instance, David Coleman, a professor of demography at Oxford University, has shown that on current trends, the people who identify as white British will cease to be a majority in the United Kingdom by 2060. However, he stresses, if current levels of immigration to Britain continue, let alone rise, the white British population will become a minority even sooner. Now, it needs to be stressed once again that this is not the opinion of some online blog. It's the opinion of David Coleman, a demographer from Oxford University. So, a people that once controlled 25% of the world will soon be a minority in their own country. And this same thing is happening all over Europe. You need to ask yourself, how on earth did this happen? Now, that's obviously a big question, and if we were to go through all the answers, we would sort of be going beyond the scope of this podcast, which is supposed to just be an introduction. But one of the things that I think is super relevant to that question is the sort of historical guilt that Europeans feel. The average European feels this great sense of historical guilt. They feel like they need to atone for the things that were done during the age of exploration. And yet most people know next to nothing about this period of history, if they're being honest. They don't really know anything about Captain Cook. They don't really know anything about Christopher Columbus. They don't really know anything about Cecil Rhodes. They haven't taken the time to learn about these people. And yet, they have a strong sense that these people, who were worshipped as heroes only a few decades ago, are evil. So people have this immense sense of guilt about a historical period that, if they're being honest, they really know nothing about. In my country, Captain Cook's statue is frequently vandalized. People call for it to be removed. Why do people do this? Why do they have such animosity towards the first European who discovered the east coast of Australia? It's because they wish that discovery had never occurred. It's because they wish that we weren't here. Now, take a moment to think about how crazy that is. Put aside the morals and think about it from a purely practical political perspective. How can you defend a country when a significant number of your own people think you shouldn't be here? This is a totally untenable situation, and the only way we can solve it is by revising the way that we think about our history. We need to revise the way we think about the age of exploration, and we need to revise the way we think about colonization if we want to survive, if we want a future here. Now, I think this is one of the things that will hopefully make this podcast unique. There's tons of podcasts on exploration and colonization, but they're all negative and they're all critical. I don't plan to be critical and negative about our history. I don't plan to be polemical either. I'm going to stick to the facts, and I believe that you can present a heroic vision of our history just by sticking to the facts. You don't need to make things up. You don't need to embellish. I don't think the history books that were written 100 years ago embellished. I don't think that they made things up. I think that they did present the facts, the same facts that you would find in modern history books, but they choose to interpret those facts in a different way. Now, a moment ago, I spoke about the link between territorial expansion and intellectual expansion, about how territorial discoveries led to intellectual discoveries and vice versa. I now want to speak about the link between territorial contraction and the contraction or the closing of the European mind. Just as there has been a dramatic shrinking in the amount of territory controlled by Europeans, there has been a dramatic shrinking in the Overton window. The range of acceptable opinions is constantly contracting. In order to be a published author or academic, you need to avoid certain topics, and the list of topics that you need to avoid is constantly growing. Can any great ideas be generated in such a stifling environment? It's very doubtful. And that's why we failed to produce any really interesting thinkers in the past 50 years, despite, the explosive growth of the university and the academic class. So many people feel confined and constrained intellectually. They also feel crushed spiritually. There's something very soulless about the modern world, and you don't need to be religious to recognize this. Even the staunchest atheist will use the word soulless to describe a newly built suburb. In such a soulless environment, atheism ends up becoming the default condition of man, and that means he's unable to find consolation in religion. Perhaps consolation isn't the word I'm actually looking for. What I'm trying to say, people have often found freedom in the spiritual realm when they're confined in the physical realm. I think this is why a lot of men find God when they're in prison. Spirituality offers them a sense of freedom in captivity, but the spiritual realm is increasingly foreign to the average person. That's not an option for them. Now, I'm not saying all of this to just rant. I'm trying to describe my motivation for starting a podcast about the exploration of unknown lands. When we look around, when we look at modern European man, we see someone who is constricted and confined intellectually, spiritually, and physically. He lives in a sort of open-air zoo. People often describe modern cities as concrete jungles, but that metaphor is totally wrong. Jungles are wild places. The animals within them need to struggle to survive. But a modern city is not a wild place. A modern city is much more like a zoo. In a zoo, the problems of survival are reduced to a minimum. The animals are provided all the necessities of life without having to actually exert themselves. They're liberated from the struggle for existence, basically. But this liberation comes at a great cost. If you go to a zoo, you'll notice that the animals within them develop all sorts of pathologies. I visited a zoo not that long ago, and one of the saddest things I witnessed was a tiger sort of compulsively walking in circles. It sort of looked like a schizophrenic guy you'd see at a train station. The sort of guy, he stinks like piss, he talks to himself, he walks around in circles. You can sort of see the same behavior manifesting in the tiger, and that's because captivity breeds pathology. There's this book by a guy called Desmond Morris. It's called The Human Zoo. I'm going to quickly quote this book because I think it demonstrates the point that I'm trying to make very well. So it says, under normal conditions, in their natural habitats, wild animals do not mutilate themselves, masturbate, attack their offspring, develop stomach ulcers, become fetishists, suffer from obesity, form homosexual pair bonds, or commit murder. Among human city dwellers, needless to say, all of these things occur. Does this then reveal a basic difference between the human species and other animals? At first glance, it seems to do so, but this is deceptive. Other animals do behave in these ways under certain circumstances, namely when they are confined in the unnatural conditions of captivity. The zoo animal in a cage exhibits all these abnormalities that we know so well from our human companions. Okay, there's the end of the quote. Now, Desmond Morris goes on to say that the modern city dweller can be compared to a captive zoo animal. And I'm going to quote the book one last time. The modern human animal is no longer living in conditions natural for his species. Trapped, not by a zoo collector, but by his own brainy brilliance, he has set himself up in a huge, restless menagerie where he is in constant danger of cracking under the strain. Despite the pressures, however, the benefits are great. The zoo world, like a gigantic parent, protects its inmates. Food, drink, shelter, hygiene, and medical care are provided. The basic problems of survival are reduced to a minimum. There is time to spare. How this time is used in a non-human zoo varies, of course, from species to species. Some animals quietly relax and doze in the sun. Others find prolonged inactivity increasingly difficult to accept. Okay, I'll end the quote there. So he goes on to write about how animals that struggle with the prolonged inactivity go on to develop the pathologies that were mentioned a moment ago. You know, some mutilate themselves, some develop compulsive habits, some become obese. Many refuse to breed under conditions of captivity. Now, obviously something similar is happening to us. People are castrating themselves, people are obese, people are increasingly not reproducing, and a significant number of people suffer from some kind of mental illness. Now, I think this can be attributed to the fact that we are increasingly living in a captive zoo-like state, that we are constrained and confined intellectually, physically, and spiritually. And in this captive state, people begin to engage in self-destructive behavior. And when I say that, I mean it literally. They're trying to destroy themselves. They don't want to live under conditions of captivity, so they begin to engage in life-denying or even suicidal behavior. James Burnham described leftism as the ideology of Western suicide, and I think that's spot on. I also think that there have been similar religious, political, and philosophical movements in the past. None of them were as destructive as leftism, but I think many of them were driven by the same self-destructive instinct. I think you can sort of explain why many Roman citizens became celibate monks in the late stages of the Roman Empire. They realized that they were unable to rule and conquer, and so they stopped reproducing. In other words, the Roman citizen became a celibate monk for the same reason that many animals refuse to breed in zoos. Now, this is not my idea. It's a Bronze Age perverts. I'm going to play a snippet from a conversation he had with William Wheelwright, where he briefly discusses this idea.
I know a man who is Assyrian, okay? Not Syrian, but with Assyrian, you know, okay, with the A before.
Yes.
And, well, this is longer subject. I don't know if people want to hear this now, but this man come from a culture, as you know, ruled the ancient Middle East. They... Machiavelli
Nebuchadnezzar,
say,
yes.
Yes, Machiavelli, there's Babylon.
Is he Assyrian? Sorry.
Yeah, but Machiavelli say virtù was first born among the Assyrians, and then it kept moving west in successive ways to the Greeks, to the Romans, and so forth. And this people of military virtue and conquest, and they ended up, you know, losing their empire. And then he's very interested what happened because these men, okay, of this empire, they want naturally to be conquerors, but they can't, okay? So rather than be, let's say, a taxpayer sheep for the Muslims who ended up ruling that area, I believe that the most manly among them became monks. And this exemplifies some way Nietzsche saying that Herrenvolk, a people of masters, either rules or it dies out. And there is a very direct way, I think, biological way by which this happens, which is the ones who would be normally generals, conquerors, and so forth, cannot conceive of life as a tax cow for somebody else, you know, so they become monks. You know, they cannot breed under conditions of captivity. They become monks.
In addition to Bowden, the other major inspiration for this podcast is Bronze Age Pervert, the person you were just listening to. One of the central themes of his book, Bronze Age Mindset, is the struggle for space. There's been so much commentary about this book, countless articles written, especially recently, but very rarely do these articles actually discuss the central thesis of the book, which is very interesting and also very relevant to this podcast. So I would say the central thesis of Bronze Age Mindset, if it has one, is that life is about a struggle for ownership of space. And this idea is what actually inspired me to make a podcast about exploration and colonization. And so I think it's worth briefly going over that idea. So Bronze Age Mindset begins with a discussion about biology and Darwinism. Bap says that Darwin's description of life is actually wrong. Darwin said that all life was driven by, a will to survive and reproduce, and on the whole, that appears to be correct. However, there appears to be exceptions. We've already mentioned one, namely the fact that, some animals will refuse to breed in captivity. Take a moment to think about that. If all life merely strove to survive and reproduce, as Darwin suggested, why would certain animals refuse to breed under conditions of captivity? And that's just one example that contradicts the idea that all life is driven by this desire. Bap lists a couple which are worth considering. So he mentions the fact that, Germanic mothers would kill their own children when the Roman legions would close in. And the Jews did something similar. You all know about the samurai class in Japan and how they would commit seppuku to avoid capture or defeat. You've probably all seen the footage of Buddhist monks setting themselves on fire to protest the Vietnam War. Now, you could easily dismiss this behavior as a cultural phenomenon, if not for the fact that some animals appear to do the exact same thing. As we said before, some animals begin to mutilate themselves, refuse to eat, refuse to breed under conditions of captivity. If all life strove for mere survival and reproduction, you would not witness this sort of self-destructive behavior from animals and humans. There seems to be a biological urge for more than survival and reproduction. This seems to suggest that Darwin was actually wrong in a fundamental way. Now, the first person to make this critique of Darwin was Nietzsche. He made this critique a number of times and in a number of different books. In The Gay Science, he wrote, "The wish to preserve oneself is a sign of distress, a limitation of the truly basic life instinct, which aims at the expansion of power, and in so doing often enough risks and sacrifices self-preservation." And again, in Beyond Good and Evil, he wrote, "Physiologists should think, therefore, before putting down the instinct of self-preservation as the cardinal instinct of an organic being. A living thing seeks to discharge its strength. Life itself is will to power." Okay, I could have given 3 or 4 more examples from Nietzsche, but you get the point. Life isn't actually about self-preservation, according to Nietzsche. Darwin is wrong. But here is the thing. He isn't completely wrong. His theory accurately explains most life. Most people and most animals are motivated simply by the desire to survive and reproduce. If they can do these two things relatively comfortably, they will be happy. In other words, Darwin is describing a botched or failed form of life, but he is not describing all life. It is not all life that strives for mere survival and reproduction, but only failed life. The desire to merely preserve oneself is a sign of sickness or slavery. In other words, a man that is not concerned with the shape or condition in which he lives, provided only that he survives and reproduces, is sick. The healthy, by contrast, seek to expand themselves. They often do this to the detriment of their own personal survival. And this brings us to, the concept of the struggle for space, which I mentioned earlier on. Nietzsche says that all life struggles for power, that there is a will to power rather than a will to life, and that all healthy beings are in touch with this will to power. Bap says that life is really about a struggle for ownership of space. Now, really, it's the same thing. The will to power and the struggle for ownership of space. It's the same idea. Bap has just modernized it and given a spin on it, and I actually find what Bap says easier to understand. Now, I want to apologize for including this super lengthy aphorism from Bap. I understand that listening to someone read is not always the most pleasant experience for the listener. It sort of disrupts the flow of a podcast. But I think that Bap explains this idea better than I could, so I'm going to make use of what he says. This is aphorism 13 from Bronze Age Mindset. I think this aphorism pretty much sums up the core thesis of the book. So here goes. Struggle for space. A healthy animal not under distress, not maimed, not trapped by man, seeks first when young, space. Animal seeks space in physical sense, territory, but this meaning isn't crudely physical. I give this as vivid image, which is true for many animals that seek ownership of concrete territory. But more generally, you must take it to mean something else, space to develop inborn powers. Monkey that lives in trees seeks skills to master canopy. Beaver seeks ownership of river and banks and reeds in its grasp. Many big cat, of course, seek mastership of actual territory and claims to prey and mates in this territory. They seek these things because they want to master matter. All of this is higher organism organizing itself to master matter in surrounding space. Successful mastery of matter leads to development of inborn powers and flourishing of organism, which allows it to master more matter to marshal the lower to feed the higher. Okay, I'll finish reading the aphorism there. I want to repeat the last part and relate it to what I was saying earlier on. So, Bap says the successful mastery of matter leads to the development of inborn powers and the flourishing of the organism, which in turn allows the organism to master more matter. And I basically said the exact same thing before when I spoke about the age of discovery, how the conquest of new territory stimulated the sciences, which in turn led to the conquest of more territory. As man masters matter, as he conquers territory, his inborn powers begin to grow. And as these powers grow, so too does his ability to conquer more territory. It's a sort of a circular process. The organism begins by seeking mastery over its environment, to master matter in ways particular to its own abilities. And as a result of this mastery of matter or the environment, there is development of the body and mind. The basic idea being outlined here is, if I was to try and summarize it, is that the struggle for ownership of space is what leads to the flourishing of an organism. And the struggle for ownership of space is really what healthy life strives for. It's not to just reproduce and survive. It strives for mastery over matter. That's what a healthy organism strives for. Now, if the organism cannot do that because it is in captivity, it will decay. It will become sick. Everyone knows this to some extent. Consider the Kelpie living in a city apartment. These Kelpies just go absolutely insane. They literally become mentally ill. And that's because they have not been given an opportunity to master matter, to control and own space. And in the absence of that opportunity, they begin to degenerate. When people feel trapped, when people feel claustrophobic, they're not able to flourish. They're not able to develop their inborn powers. They become stunted. Now, many people will protest against the idea that they're trapped. But I think those people need to ask themselves, are you more like an animal in the wild or a zoo animal? The reality is, for the vast majority of people living today, the answer is that you're more like a zoo animal. You live in a simulated environment. I mean, just think about what happened over the past couple of years. Throughout most of the globe, people were told to stay in their homes for the better part of 2 years. Going outside was basically criminalized. You couldn't go outside for more than your allocated 30 minutes of exercise. That was a punishable offense. You were living in a totally simulated environment. And this is not how you're supposed to live. The man living on the Australian frontier in the 18th century was not living in a simulated environment. He was living in a wild environment which he strove to master. And in the process of that struggle, he developed himself. If you read Teddy Roosevelt's biography, in which he discusses his time in the American West, you get a sense of what life is really supposed to be about. Now, here's the thing. People like him ended up being so successful in their struggle against nature that they completely conquered it. And in so doing, they created the world that we now inhabit. A world in which we are trapped, not by a zoo collector, but by our own brainy brilliance. Through imperialism, through innovation, through industry, Western man has conquered nature and brought civilization to every corner of the globe. In so doing, he has, ultimately conquered himself. I'll just quickly, briefly quote Bronze Age mindset once again. In the long run, the development of civilization and comfort leads to the proliferation of damaged life. The innovation of mankind leads to unspeakable abortions of life. End quote. And that's exactly right. Just think about the kids currently growing up in these newly built suburbs. They have no real opportunity to explore or to grow. And so they spend all their time, on their phone or playing video games. Think about what that does to them emotionally, physically, spiritually. It totally stunts them. Now, compare this to the life of a 12-year-old boy in the British Navy. If you've watched the movie Master and Commander, which is a great film, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The British Navy used to employ kids as young as 12 on their naval expeditions and their voyages of exploration. And these young kids would be the assistants to various members of the expedition, particularly the scientists, the officers, or, other crew members. Now, some people would cynically dismiss this as child exploitation, but the actual reason they did this was because they wanted to provide the young man with extensive training and practical experience in the art of seamanship, in the art of navigation, in the art of naval warfare. I think Horatio Nelson, who's the most famous man of the British Royal Navy, and probably the greatest naval commander in all of human history, he began his naval career when he was 12. Most people are now trapped in some sort of educational institution until they're in their mid to late 20s. This guy was in the Royal Navy when he was 12. What's the modern equivalent of that? There isn't one. There's no modern equivalent of that. So anyway, I want to look at the age of exploration and colonization because I think you get to see what life is like in a state of ascent. You get to see what life is actually about. You get to see people struggling for ownership of space, people going upwards and outwards, physically, mentally, and spiritually. Now, I understand that most Europeans during this time did not live a life of adventure, but a significant minority actually did live a life of adventure. Many spent their lives battling the wilderness on a frontier, battling the forces of nature. Many spent their lives on the open seas, discovering new worlds. Many spent their lives ruling in foreign lands, where they were desperately outnumbered by the local populace. But just as importantly, many spent their lives discovering laws about the universe, discovering new technological innovations, new artistic and philosophical innovations. As I said before, territorial expansion spurred the intellect to new heights. This was a time of ascent, expansion, innovation, and exploration. You could argue that this was the highest peak of European history, and yet it's remembered now in the popular consciousness as a dark chapter in our history. People constantly cast aspersions on the people who lived back then. But what do you think those people would think about us? It's actually an interesting thought experiment. Imagine you could get our political elite in the same room as the political elite of the 18th or 19th century. The political elite at that time, they fought in wars, they spoke multiple languages, they organized expeditions, they were patrons of the arts. In many cases, they were themselves artists, philosophers, and scientists. If that elite came across our elite, they would consider them the most pathetic little rabble. And yet, this pathetic little rabble considers itself morally and intellectually superior to the people of that time, a people that they really know nothing about. And to be frank, I don't know enough about these people either. Part of the reason I wanted to make this podcast is because I don't know enough about my own history. And I think that describes a significant percentage of our people. Most of our people, whether they're left-wing or right-wing, know next to nothing about their own history. If you want to defend Western civilization, you need to actually know what Western civilization is. It's not enough to be against something, you need to actually be for something. And in order to be for something, you need to actually understand it. So that's the motivation for the show. I hope you enjoy it, and thank you for listening.